She had 3 rules for surviving other people's weddings. Don't cry at the vows, don't drink the open bar champagne before the cake is cut, and absolutely, under no circumstances, make eye contact with anyone who looked like they owned something. Nadia had broken the first 2 rules by 7 in the evening. She was working on the 3rd. The reception was on the 47th floor of the Vos Grand, the kind of hotel that didn't advertise its rates, because if you had to ask, you'd already answered your own question. Nadia had been here since 4 in the afternoon, moving through the event with her clipboard and her earpiece and her sensible flats, making sure the centerpieces were exactly 40 centimeters tall, and the string quartet knew to pause between pieces, and the wedding planner's assistant knew never to let the bride's mother near the groom's family's table without a buffer of at least 2 neutral parties. She was good at her job. That was the thing about Nadia Reyes. She was exceptionally, invisibly good at her job, and nobody ever noticed, which was precisely the point. Event coordination was the art of making everything look effortless, and the more effortless it looked, the more completely you had disappeared into the machinery of the evening. By 9, her feet were informing her of their strong and well-reasoned objections to standing for 5 consecutive hours in a venue with no chairs designated for staff. By 9:30, the bride had cried twice, the groom had spilled champagne on his own lapel, and the string quartet had played the same Debussy piece 3 times because the playlist manager had developed a migraine. By 10, Nadia had handled all 3 of these situations without anyone noticing she had handled them, which meant she had done her job correctly. At 10:15, she was finally given clearance to take her break. She took the service stairs down 2 floors, found a corridor that smelled of linen and commercial cleaning fluid, and stood with her back against the wall for approximately 4 minutes, eyes closed, breathing in the particular silence that lived inside expensive hotels at night. Then she checked her phone, saw 17 messages that could wait, and decided she needed coffee with a desperation that felt almost spiritual. The hotel's lower lobby had a cafe that stayed open until midnight. She'd spotted it on her sight walk that morning, noted it with the professional reflex of someone who always located the nearest exit, the nearest bathroom, and the nearest caffeine source within the first 15 minutes of any venue. She took the elevator. Or what she thought was the elevator. The Vos Grand's 45th floor had 2 elevator banks. One was clearly marked with brushed brass signage and a small lobby area with a velvet bench and a mirror. The other was at the end of a short corridor, behind a door that looked like a wall panel if you weren't looking carefully, which Nadia wasn't, because she was reading a message from the florist about a centerpiece that had reportedly developed a structural integrity problem in the last 40 minutes. She pressed the button. The doors opened immediately, which should have told her something. Hotel elevators did not open immediately. Hotel elevators made you wait, as a matter of principle, as a reminder that you were a guest and the building was in charge. This one opened as if it had been expecting her. She stepped inside. The interior was not the interior of a service elevator, or a guest elevator, or any elevator she had ever used in a hotel at any price point. There was no panel of numbered buttons, no emergency phone behind a small metal door, no slightly scratched mirror reflecting a slightly exhausted woman back at herself. There was a single panel with a handprint scanner, a narrow display showing only 2 options, and walls upholstered in something dark and quiet that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Nadia looked at this for exactly 1 second. Then, the doors closed behind her. She turned, reached for the panel, and only then noticed the man already standing in the elevator. He was standing at the far end, which in any normal elevator would have been 3 feet away, but in this one was somehow a sufficient distance that she had not immediately registered his presence. He was tall, which her eyes processed first, then still, which her instincts processed second, in the way that stillness in a person registers differently than the absence of movement. He wasn't simply not moving. He was contained. Deliberate, the kind of still that suggested he had decided to be still, the way other people decided to speak. He was looking at the display panel. He did not look at her. Nadia's hand found the wall panel. There were, she confirmed, 2 destination options: the lobby, and a floor labeled only with a Roman numeral that meant nothing to her. She pressed the lobby option. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. The man's voice arrived in the silence, like something dropped into still water. Low, unhurried, with an accent she couldn't locate geographically, something old and Western European, smoothed by time into something that no longer quite belonged to any specific country. That requires authorization, he said. He still had not looked at her. Nadia processed this. She was tired. Her feet hurt. She had 17 unread messages and a structurally compromised centerpiece 42 floors above her, and no coffee, and this elevator, which she had entered in good faith, apparently required authorization to go to the lobby. Authorization for the lobby, she repeated. The display, he said. She looked at the display. It had changed. There was now a third option, which had not been there before, or which she had not seen, and which read, in very small letters, "Lobby authorized personnel only." She looked at this. She looked at him. He was still looking at the display with the focused calm of someone who found the current situation entirely unremarkable. "Are you authorized?" she asked, not as a challenge, simply as a practical question from someone attempting to solve a logistical problem. He looked at her then, for the first time. His eyes were dark, and they were the kind of dark that made you recalibrate what dark meant, the way some nights made you recalibrate what night meant. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not cold, not warm. Precise, maybe, the way a person looks when they are deciding something. "Yes," he said. The elevator began to move. Nadia looked at the display. It read 47. They were going up. She had a policy about unexpected situations. Assess, adapt, continue. It was the same policy she applied to centerpieces with structural integrity problems, and string quartets with migraines, and brides who cried at the wrong moment, and grooms who spilled champagne on Italian wool. You assessed what was actually happening, as opposed to what you feared was happening. You adapted your approach accordingly, and then you continued, because events did not pause for you to have feelings about them. She assessed. She was in an elevator that was not a hotel elevator. It was moving upward toward the 47th floor, which was where she had just come from, which meant this elevator had a direct line to the event floor, which was information she could have used several hours ago. The man standing at the other end of the elevator was approximately 6 feet 2, wearing a dark suit that had been made specifically for him, in the way that very few people's suits were made specifically for them, and he had spoken 4 words to her across 2 exchanges, all of them useful and none of them threatening. She adapted. She turned back to face the doors and decided to treat this the way she treated most unexpected situations, as a brief inconvenience with a logical resolution on the other side. The elevator continued upward. The man said nothing. This was, she noticed, a particular kind of silence, not the silence of someone who had run out of things to say, or the silence of someone who was waiting for her to speak first, or the awkward pressurized silence of 2 strangers in a small space, both pretending the other one didn't exist. This was the silence of someone who simply didn't feel the need to fill it, who was comfortable in it the way people were comfortable in rooms they had lived in for a long time. It made her want to count floors. She was at floor 31 when she spoke, not because she had decided to, but because the alternative was standing in measured silence for another 16 floors, and she had already used up her quota of measured silence for the evening. "I was trying to get to the lobby," she said. "I know," he said. She waited. He didn't add anything. The floor counter moved to 32. "Is this your elevator?" she asked. "It belongs to the hotel," he said. "That is a very specific way of not answering my question," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was shorter than a laugh, and quieter. More like the beginning of a laugh that had been redirected into something more composed. She filed this away without examining why she was filing it away. "I have an event on 47, she said, more to herself than to him. "I know," he said again. She looked at him. He was looking at the display panel. "How do you know?" she said. "The Theron wedding," he said. "You've been managing it since 4 this afternoon. You've resolved a seating conflict, a playlist failure, 2 separate incidents involving the florist, and a situation with the mother of the bride that the groom's family will probably never know about." The floor counter read 34. Nadia turned to face him more fully. "You've been watching me," she said. It came out less alarmed than she intended, possibly because her tone had calibrated itself to match the register of the conversation, which was oddly calm. He did look at her then, directly, without the brief apologetic glance of someone caught doing something they knew they shouldn't. He looked at her the way you looked at something you'd been watching, because it was worth watching. "Your work is interesting," he said simply. She waited for more. He didn't offer more. "My work," she said. "The way you move through a space," he said. "Most people in event management are visible. They want to be visible. They treat problems as opportunities to demonstrate competence in front of an audience." He paused. "You solve things before they become problems. You make yourself smaller when the situation requires it. You never take credit for anything." He looked back at the display. "That kind of work is harder than it looks." Nadia processed this. She had been working in event coordination for 7 years. She had managed corporate galas, political fundraisers, celebrity weddings, product launches, and one deeply memorable memorial dinner that had involved a live orchestra and a seating chart disputed by 3 separate legal teams. In 7 years, she had received exactly 4 compliments, 2 of which had been about her clipboard organization system. Nobody had ever described watching her work as interesting. She wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that. About him noticing, specifically, about the fact that she wasn't sure how she felt about it. She looked at his reflection in the narrow strip of glass beside the door panel. The suit was charcoal, not black, which was a distinction most people wouldn't have made, but which she noticed because she noticed things. His hands were still at his sides. His shoulders were level. He carried himself with the particular calm of someone for whom composure was not an effort. Vampires, she knew, were like that. The old ones especially. She'd worked in event management long enough to have worked events that included vampire clients, and the older they were, the less they seemed to expend on anything unnecessary. Emotion, movement, speech, everything was conserved, rationed, precise, like they'd learned somewhere around their 2nd century that energy spent performing was energy wasted, and they'd made a quiet executive decision to stop performing entirely. This one was old. She couldn't have said exactly how she knew. It wasn't the obvious things. He didn't have the deliberately archaic qualities some old vampires had, where they wore their age like a costume, referencing centuries they'd lived in with the casual pride of someone name-dropping. He was dressed perfectly for the present. He moved like someone who understood the current world and had decided, on full information, how to exist within it. But there was something underneath all of that, a kind of patience that went beyond personality. The patience of someone for whom time had restructured itself, stopped being a resource that ran out, and became instead something closer to weather. Always present. Not threatening. Just there. She found herself wanting to know how old. She did not ask. The floor counter read 39. She had 8 floors left, and then the doors would open, and she would step back into the event, and the earpiece, and the clipboard, and the 17 messages, and this strange, quiet interval would be over. He will want to know your name, she thought, and then was surprised that she'd thought it. He hadn't asked. That was the other thing she'd noticed. He'd watched her work for hours apparently. He'd identified her, described what she did with more accuracy than her own professional bio managed. And he had not asked her name. Most men, when they wanted something from you, began with your name. It was a claiming gesture, she'd always thought, putting a word on a person before they'd agreed to give it. He hadn't done that. Floor 41. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He waited. "Why didn't you say anything?" she said, "when I got in? You could have told me this wasn't a guest elevator. You could have told me to get out. Why did you let me stay?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone formulating a diplomatic answer, the silence of someone who was deciding how honest to be. "Because you needed a moment," he said finally, "and because I wanted to see if you'd panic." "Did I?" she asked. "No," he said, and something in the way he said it told her the answer had mattered to him. The counter read 46. She turned back toward the door. "My name is Nadia," she said. Not because he'd asked, because she'd decided to give it. She saw, in the narrow strip of reflective glass, the very slight shift in his expression. Not surprise. Something quieter, like a door opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. "I know," he said. Of course he did. The doors opened on 47. The event looked exactly as she'd left it. This was both a professional relief and a mild personal disappointment, in the way that returning to ordinary life after an unexpected interlude always carried its small sting. The string quartet had moved on from Debussy. The centerpiece situation had apparently resolved itself, or had been resolved by her assistant Priya, who was more capable than she let on. The bride was laughing with her grandmother near the window. The groom had changed his lapel pocket square to cover the champagne stain, which Nadia had not suggested, and which meant he was either more self-aware than she'd credited, or someone had suggested it for him. She moved back into the event like water finding its level. In her earpiece, Priya's voice appeared. "You were gone longer than 15 minutes. The elevator situation was complicated," Nadia said. Brief pause. Define complicated. Wrong elevator. Another pause. How wrong? Private, wrong floor. She hesitated. There was a man. The pause that followed this was the precise length of a pause that meant Priya was assembling a response she would deploy later, when the event was over and they were in a car going home and Nadia had no professional obligation to maintain composure. "We'll talk later," Priya said, in the tone of someone filing something for future reference. The next 45 minutes moved with the particular momentum of an event in its final third. Everything slightly accelerating toward the conclusion, conversations getting louder and more relaxed, people checking their phones openly now, the pretense of formality having served its purpose and been quietly retired. Nadia moved through it all with her clipboard and her earpiece and her capacity for invisibility, and she told herself she was not thinking about the elevator. She was thinking about the elevator. Not with alarm. That was the thing she kept returning to, the absence of alarm. She'd been alone in a non-standard elevator with a vampire she didn't know, going to a floor she hadn't chosen, and she had not been frightened. She'd been curious. She'd been, if she was being precise about it, more alert than she'd been all evening, in the way that a brain sharpens when it encounters something that doesn't fit its existing patterns. He'd known who she was. He'd watched her work for hours. He'd let her stay in his elevator, because she needed a moment, and because he wanted to see if she'd panic. Both of these things were true simultaneously, which meant he'd given her something and assessed her at the same time, and she couldn't decide if that was generous or calculating, and the honest answer was probably both. You needed a moment. The thing was, he'd been right. She had needed it. She hadn't known she'd needed it until she was in a strange, quiet elevator going the wrong direction, and then the needing of it had been so obvious she was surprised she'd missed it. She was still thinking about this when the wedding formally concluded at 11:30, and the guests began their elegant dispersal, and Nadia supervised the teardown with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this enough times that her hands knew what to do without requiring instructions from her brain. It was after midnight when the last of her team finished packing. Priya handed her a coffee from the cafe downstairs with the precise expression of someone who had thought ahead and wanted credit for it. "Tell me," Priya said. "There's nothing to tell," Nadia said. "You were in a private elevator with a man for an unknown length of time, and you came back looking like you'd been slightly rearranged," Priya said. "There's something to tell." Nadia considered this. "Did I look rearranged?" Priya made a gesture that communicated yes without requiring the word. "I don't know who he was," Nadia said. "He was a vampire. Old, he knew who I was somehow. He watched me work. He said my work was interesting." "He said your work was interesting?" Priya repeated, as if verifying. "Yes, and he let you stay in his elevator, even though it was clearly not a guest elevator." "Yes," Priya looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "That's unusual behavior." "I know. Did he ask for anything?" "No." "Did he give you his name?" "No." "Did he ask for yours?" "No. I gave it to him at the end. He already knew it." Another pause. Priya had a very precise relationship with pauses, using them the way punctuation was intended to be used but rarely was. "That's interesting," she said finally. "I know," Nadia said. "Are you going to see him again?" "I don't know who he is," Nadia said. "I don't know his name. He was in a private elevator in the Vos Grand. That's all I have." Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who had approximately 4 more things to say and was choosing which ones to deploy. "You're going to find out," she said, which was not one of the things Nadia had expected. "Am I?" Nadia said. "You already are," Priya said. "You're doing it right now." Nadia looked at her coffee. This was, she recognized, the thing about Priya. She was perceptive in the way that people were perceptive when they paid attention to you over a long time, when they'd been watching you make decisions in high-pressure situations and had learned the particular language of your silences. She was right. Nadia was already running the question. Hotel records weren't accessible to her, but the venue manager might know who had booked the private elevator access. The event client list included corporate sponsors of the Theron family, and a 47th floor private elevator wasn't a coincidence. It was a choice. Someone had wanted to be at the Vos Grand tonight on a floor with direct elevator access to a wedding they hadn't attended, and the number of people who would do that were probably small. "You could just let it go," Priya offered, in the tone of someone who did not believe this was going to happen. "I could," Nadia said. They both understood this was not a serious option. The ride back through the city was quiet. Nadia watched the lights through the window, the particular way this city looked after midnight, the way the dark made it look smaller and more honest somehow, the way very bright cities always looked more like themselves when most of the performance had been switched off for the night. She thought about the elevator. She thought about the specific texture of that silence. She thought about a man who'd watched her work for hours and described it with more accuracy than anyone had managed in 7 years, and who hadn't asked her name, and who had looked at her when she gave it with an expression she kept returning to. Like a door opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. She was being fanciful. She knew she was being fanciful. It was midnight, and she'd been on her feet for 8 hours, and her coffee was still warm, and she was tired in the particular way that allowed feelings through that daylight, generally kept managed and professional and correctly filed. Still, a door opening in a room closed for a long time. She'd know that expression. She'd worn it herself, probably. The expression of someone who has been largely alone with their own thoughts for a significant period and has arrived at the state where aloneness is no longer lonely but simply the condition of things, the default setting. And then something unexpected happens, and you remember briefly what it felt like when it wasn't the default. He was a vampire. Centuries old, probably, The idea that a man like that would be lonely was almost too large to hold. The math of it staggering. All that time, all that accumulated experience, all those rooms and people and places and the world changing around you while you stayed the same, the world dying and growing again and dying again, everyone you'd known becoming history, that would be its own kind of silence. She imagined it would make you very careful about where you directed your attention, very precise about what you found worth watching. She pressed her face against the cool window glass and watched the city and told herself to stop. But the question was already open, and she'd never been particularly good at leaving open questions alone. She found out his name on a Thursday. She hadn't planned Thursday specifically. She'd spent the 3 days following the Theron wedding in a state of studied normalcy, managing 2 corporate luncheons, a product launch at a venue that smelled aggressively of eucalyptus, and a birthday dinner for a technology executive who'd wanted everything in shades of gold, which had required Nadia to develop a previously non-existent professional opinion on the spectrum between amber and champagne. The question had stayed open the entire time. She'd asked the Voss Grand's event manager, a precise woman named Heloise, who'd been managing the hotel's events since before Nadia's career existed, whether the private elevator access on 45 was corporate or residential. Heloise had looked at her with the specific expression of a professional who recognized another professional attempting to extract information by the indirect route. Corporate suite access, Heloise said. Long-term lease. Very private arrangement. Nadia had nodded and made a note on her clipboard that meant nothing and moved on, because pushing further with Heloise would have cost her more professional goodwill than she was willing to spend on what was, she kept reminding herself, simply an open question. The answer came, as answers often did, from a direction she hadn't been looking. She was doing a site visit for an upcoming charity gala at the Meridian Center when she passed through the lobby and saw him on a framed event poster. Not prominently. He wasn't the subject of the poster. It was an architectural photograph of the Meridian Center's Grand Hall during a previous event, a full room of people in formal wear, lit beautifully, the kind of image that conveyed scale and elegance simultaneously. He was at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, turned partially away, and she would not have recognized him at all, except that she'd been in a small elevator with him for 16 floors and had spent 3 days thinking about the set of his shoulders. She stopped walking. She looked at the poster for a moment, the way you looked at something when you were trying to confirm what you were seeing without admitting you were looking for it. Then she looked at the small caption at the bottom of the frame. It named the event. A fundraising gala, 2 years prior. It named the lead sponsors. The first name on the list was Ashford Voss Partners. She knew Ashford. Everyone in this city's event industry knew Ashford. Ashford Industries was the dominant force in about 40% of the city's commercial real estate and financial infrastructure, run by Lucian Ashford, who had been in the news recently for reasons having to do with a canceled wedding and some kind of corporate restructuring that the business pages found very exciting. She'd coordinated 2 Ashford Industries corporate events in the past 4 years, both handled through intermediaries, client never present. Voss, she didn't know. She thought about the Voss Grand, the hotel. The way the private elevator hadn't felt like a hotel amenity, the way it had felt like something that belonged to the building in a different way. Private arrangement, Heloise had said. Long-term lease. She pulled out her phone and searched Voss. The results were sparse in the way that very powerful things were sometimes sparse online, not because information didn't exist, but because it was managed. What existed was professional, board memberships, a few industry references, a brief mention in a financial article as a silent partner in Ashford Voss Partners. The name attached to Voss in that article was Caius. No last name in the article, just Caius. Attributed to him was a single quote, pulled from what appeared to be a rare published interview, possibly years old, given the style of the accompanying text. The quote read, "I have found that most problems in business, as in life, resolve themselves if you are patient enough to wait for them to become clear before you act." Nadia stood in the lobby of the Meridian Center and read this sentence twice. The patience of someone for whom time had restructured itself. The patience of someone for whom waiting was not a hardship because time was not a resource that ran out. She put her phone in her pocket and stood for a moment, and then she resumed her site visit with the focused efficiency of someone who was going to process this information in an orderly fashion and not immediately. She processed it on the bus home. She processed it over dinner, which was pasta and a glass of wine, and the particular focused quiet of her apartment, which she'd always found restorative in the way that silence is restorative when you've chosen it rather than when it's simply the condition of things. Caius. She tried the name in her mind, the way you tried on a word you'd heard in another language for the first time, testing whether it fit against what you already knew. It was old. Older than most names she heard regularly. Roman, probably, or close to it. The kind of name that would have been ordinary once, common, worn smooth by use, and then had become rare as the world moved on without it, until it belonged only to the people who'd been carrying it long enough that the world had lapped them. You needed a moment. She had, she thought. She really had. There was a difference between being seen and being observed. She'd been observed before, professionally, evaluated, assessed, given feedback, managed. That was a different thing from what had happened in that elevator, which was closer to being seen. The way you were seen by someone who had no agenda for what they were looking at, who wasn't measuring you against a standard or deciding whether you were useful, who was simply paying attention because they found you worth it. She wasn't sure when she'd last experienced that. She thought about her mother, who had died when Nadia was 24, and who had been very good at that particular quality of attention. She thought about Priya, who had it in professional quantities, calibrated and expressed in precise short forms. She thought about the people she'd dated over the years, most of whom had been interested in the version of her that existed in their own heads, rather than the one that moved through the world making things work without asking for credit. This was getting complicated, she thought. She took a long drink of wine. She didn't know him. She'd been in an elevator with him for 16 floors and exchanged approximately 30 words and received one compliment about her professional methodology. This was not the foundation of anything. This was an encounter. Full stop. But she was a person who solved problems, and the open question had the same quality as a problem, which was that it had a shape and a weight, and it would not put itself down until she found the answer. She picked up her phone. She composed a professional email to the events coordination contact at Ashford Voss Partners, referencing a prospective inquiry about their event requirements for the coming quarter. This was not unusual. This was ordinary business development. She sent it before she could reconsider. Then she washed her glass and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the city for a while before she slept. The reply came in 4 hours, at 2 in the morning, from an address she didn't recognize, in a message that was 3 lines long. Miss Reyes, I understand you have questions. The Voss Grand Friday, 45th floor. 8 o'clock. The elevator will be expecting you. See, she read it 3 times. Then she set her phone face down on her nightstand and stared at the ceiling. The elevator will be expecting you. She was going to need better shoes. She wore the black dress. Not the event dress. Not the professional armor of her working wardrobe, but the one that had lived in the back of her closet for 2 years, waiting for an occasion she'd never quite identified. It was simple in the way that things were simple when they'd been made by someone who understood that simplicity was a form of precision. She'd bought it in a small shop in the Western Quarter on a Thursday afternoon when she'd had an hour between venues, and had walked in on impulse, which was unusual for her, and had bought it on impulse, which was more unusual still. She'd been saving it for something. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror and looked at herself with the same objectivity she applied to venues before events. assessing what was there, what worked, what might be improved upon, and what was simply what it was. "You're not an event," she told her reflection. The reflection looked unconvinced. Priya called at 7:15. "You're going," Priya said, without preamble. "I have a meeting," Nadia said, "at 8 in the evening. At the Vos Grand, on the 45th floor, with a man whose name starts with C and who sent you a message at 2 in the morning. Did I tell you all of that?" "You tell me more than you think you do," Priya said. Her voice was in a particular register that Nadia had learned to identify as the register of genuine concern underneath professional presentation. "Be careful, he's not dangerous," Nadia said, and was surprised by how certain she was. "Nadia," Priya said carefully, "old vampires are always dangerous. That's not a character flaw. It's just physics. They have more time and more power and more everything than we do. Being not dangerous is a choice they make, not a condition they're in." "I know," Nadia said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Be careful. I'll text you when I'm there and when I leave," Nadia said. "And if I don't hear from you by 10:30, Priya said. "You'll assume I'm fine and go to bed," Nadia said. "I'll call the Vos Grand's front desk and ask to speak to any vampire who recently acquired a human event coordinator," Priya said, and hung up. Nadia put her phone in her bag and looked at her reflection one more time. "Be careful," the reflection agreed. The city at 8 on a Friday had the particular energy of something releasing, the week unwinding from its obligations, people moving through streets with slightly less urgency, slightly more permission. She took a car rather than the bus because she'd told herself this was a professional meeting and professional meetings warranted the right arrival, and because she needed the 20 minutes in the back of a car to arrange herself into the version of herself she intended to be for the evening, which was the competent, curious version, and not the one who'd spent 4 days thinking about a door opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. The Vos Grand's lobby was quieter than it had been during the wedding. A Friday evening calm, the weekend energy gathering rather than deployed. The doorman acknowledged her with a small nod. She crossed the marble lobby and found the corridor on the 45th floor without difficulty this time, because she'd been looking for it. The panel door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The elevator was there, doors open, lit with the same quiet precision she remembered. She stepped in. She pressed nothing. The doors closed. The elevator moved. She watched the floor counter. Not down, up, 46, 47, 48, which she hadn't seen before. 49. The numbers moved past the top floor she'd previously accessed and kept going, into floors the hotel didn't advertise in its brochures, floors that existed in the building the way some things existed in a life present, functional, simply not mentioned. The counter stopped at 53. The doors opened. The space beyond was not what she'd expected, though she'd learned in the last week to lower her expectations of her own expectations when it came to anything connected to this. It was large. Not a penthouse in the hotel brochure sense, the kind of space designed to communicate luxury through its own excess. This was a space designed to be lived in, which was a different thing entirely. High ceilings. Bookshelves on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, the kind that required a ladder, the kind that meant the books were there to be read rather than displayed. A long table near the windows, with maps and papers spread across it. A single lamp in the corner, warm rather than bright. Windows that revealed the city below in the manner of a fact rather than a feature. Here is the city. Here is where you are in relation to it. Caius was standing at the windows. He was wearing charcoal again, but a different suit, and she noticed this the way she'd noticed the first one. With the professional reflex she couldn't turn off. He was holding something, a glass with 2 fingers of something dark, and he turned when she entered, and she went through the same recalibration she'd gone through in the elevator, the adjustment her senses required in his presence. He looked at her the way he had in the elevator, directly, without the social performance of looking away and then back. It was the kind of looking that would have been rude from most people and was from him simply honest. "You found it," he said. "The floor." "The elevator took me here," she said. "The elevator doesn't do anything on its own," he said. "You pressed a floor." She had not pressed a floor. She looked at the panel by the door. It read 53, confirming her arrival, telling her nothing else. "I didn't press anything," she said. He considered this for a moment, with the expression of someone filing something interesting for later review. Then, "Would you like something to drink?" It was offered without the particular pressure that offers sometimes carried, without the implication that refusal would mean something. It was the offer of someone who'd had enough centuries to understand that a person could be in a room with you and not need anything from you immediately. "Yes," she said. "Whatever you're having is fine." He crossed to a cabinet near the bookshelves and returned with a second glass. She took it, and he gestured toward the chairs near the windows, and they sat down, and the city spread out below them in its Friday evening state, and the silence settled around them again. Not uncomfortable. She noticed this again. The silence between them had the same quality it had had in the elevator. Not vacant, full of things that hadn't been said yet because the right moment hadn't arrived, not because they didn't exist. "You knew I'd come," she said. "I hoped," he said. She looked at him. "There's a difference," he said, "between knowing and hoping. I've learned not to confuse them." "How long has it taken you," she said, "to learn that?" He looked at the city. "A long time," he said. "I was certain of things for most of my life, about what I wanted, about what was good, about what would last and what wouldn't." He paused. Certainty is a comfort until you've been wrong enough times that the comfort starts to feel like a warning. "What were you wrong about?" she asked. He looked at her. "Almost everything," he said, with a quiet that was not self-pity, simply accuracy. "The things I thought would make me content didn't. The things I thought I didn't need turned out to matter considerably more than I'd assumed." He turned the glass in his hand. "I'm better at questions than answers now. I've made my peace with that." Nadia thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought about things that arrived with more weight than they announced. Things you had to carry for a moment before you could put them somewhere. "I'm a person who solves things," she said. "That's what I do. I walk into a broken situation and I make it work." She looked at her own glass. "I'm not sure I know how to be around a problem I'm not supposed to fix." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one. "I'm not a problem," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it complicated." They talked until 11. This surprised her, though she wasn't sure why it should have. She'd spent the past week constructing a version of this evening in her mind that was always brief and purposeful, the way she imagined encounters with powerful, ancient, entirely unknowable people would be. Brief, purposeful, conclusive in some direction. It was none of those things. He asked her questions. Not the questions people usually asked, the questions designed to locate you on the map of your life. What do you do? Where did you grow up? Are you seeing anyone? The questions that were really just ways of calculating what category of person you were. He asked her how she decided which problems to solve first when everything needed solving simultaneously. He asked her what she did when two clients had genuinely incompatible needs and there was no arrangement that satisfied both. He asked her what she found most difficult about her work, and when she said making herself small, he had a look that was very attentive and very still, and he asked her to say more. She said more. She talked about the particular exhaustion of strategic invisibility, the way it was the right tool for the job but cost something every time you applied it, how you could do it so long and so well that you forgot you were doing it, forgot it was a choice rather than simply the condition of being you in the world, how the work itself was meaningful to her, genuinely, the solving and the organizing and the making of things run. But how meaning and recognition were different things, and she'd spent 7 years being very well supplied with one, and essentially bankrupt on the other. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She was telling him this because he'd asked, and because he was listening in the specific way that made telling feel different than it usually felt, less like filling silence and more like genuine exchange. What would you do, he asked, if you didn't have to make yourself small? She looked at the city. Build something, she said. Something mine. Not coordinate other people's events. Create the events themselves. Design the whole thing from concept to execution. She paused. I have ideas. I always have ideas, and I give them to clients who use them and take credit for them and pay me my coordinator's rate, and that's fine. That's the job. But, he said, but I think about it, she said. What it would look like if the work had my name on it. He looked at her with that quality of attention that she'd spent 5 days trying to categorize and had failed, because it didn't match any category she had. He didn't look at her the way employers looked at people they were considering for something, or the way men looked at women they were interested in, or the way people looked at people they were trying to assess. He looked at her the way she imagined you looked at things after you'd had enough centuries to understand that most things were ordinary and some things weren't, and you'd learned to tell the difference. You should, he said. Just like that. No qualification. No but what about, or have you considered? Simply, you should. She laughed, which surprised her. A short, real laugh. It's more complicated than that. Most things that are worth doing are more complicated than that, he said. The complication is not the reason not to do them. She looked at him. He was making it very simple. Deliberately, she thought, in the way that people sometimes did when they wanted to cut through the scaffolding you'd built around a thing you were afraid of, to remind you what the actual thing looked like underneath. Why did you send for me? She said. Not as an accusation, as a genuine question. She'd been carrying it since Thursday night and the 3 lines at 2 a.m. He was quiet for a moment. I've attended this hotel's events for 11 years, he said. I have the suite on 53 because I work late, and the penthouse level gives me quiet. I've watched a great many events from above, through my own windows, through the perspectives the upper floors provide. I've seen a great many event coordinators. He set down his glass with the deliberate precision of someone preparing to say something exact. I've never seen someone work the way you work. He looked at her directly. I wanted to understand it better. She held this for a moment. You could have just introduced yourself, she said. The night of the wedding. Asked your question. Normal people do that. I'm not a normal person, he said. And I didn't know what my question was yet. She understood this. She was a person who needed to know what she was asking before she asked it. Running around with a vague question felt like running around in a strange building with no map, possible to do but unnecessarily chaotic. What is your question now? She asked. He looked at her. Whether you'd like to do this again, he said. Talk, not about work specifically, though I find your work interesting. Just, he seemed to choose his next words with unusual care, whether you'd be willing to let me be someone you spend time with. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the asking that was very honest, not the smooth, practiced proposition of someone accustomed to getting what they asked for. Something older than that, and quieter. The asking of someone who understood that the answer might be no, and had decided to ask anyway, because the alternative, not asking, was its own kind of loss. You've been alone a long time, she said. Yes, he said, without drama. How long, she said. He told her. She sat with the number for a moment, the way you sat with something very large before you could find the right place to put it. The city below them was the same city it had been when they'd sat down, but it looked different now, the way things looked different when you just received information that changed the scale of what you were looking at. That's a long time to not have someone to talk to, she said finally. I've had people, he said. I've had relationships, friendships, connections that lasted decades. He was careful with this, she noticed. Honest without performing openness. But they end. Everything ends, and I'm still here. And somewhere in the last century or so I stopped beginning things because I already knew how they finished. She understood this too, in a smaller, shorter-lived way. The particular mathematics of loss. The way you could become, without quite deciding to, someone who preemptively managed endings by not beginning. What changed, she said, about stopping? You, he said simply. Got into my elevator and didn't panic. She looked at her glass. That's a low bar, she said. For most people, he said, it isn't. She sat with this for a while, and the city sat with them, and the silence was the same quality of silence it had been all evening, which was the quality of something that was not empty but waiting, which was a very different thing. I can't promise you anything long, she said finally. I don't know what this is or where it goes, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I'm willing to find out what the question is. He looked at her. That door in her room closed for a long time. She saw it again, clearly this time, without the buffer of reflection or distance. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. She left at 11:15, took the elevator down alone, found it going exactly where she pressed, and walked through the lobby into the Friday city feeling slightly rearranged in a way that was, she thought, the accurate response to having just agreed to something she didn't have a category for yet. Her phone buzzed. Priya still alive? Nadia, yes. Priya and? She thought about what to say. She thought about 11 o'clock and questions and the silence between them and the number he'd given her and what it meant to begin something when you already knew how it finished. Complicated, she typed. 3 seconds. Priya, obviously. Coffee tomorrow. 8 a.m. Bring everything. Nadia smiled at her phone, walked to the corner, and caught a cab home. Above her, on the 53rd floor, the lights were still on. The complications, it turned out, were not where she'd expected them. She'd anticipated the logistics would be strange. She was correct. He kept hours that didn't fully overlap with her own, not in the vampire mythology sense. He wasn't limited by sunlight. He'd told her this plainly when she'd asked directly. Because she was a person who asked directly, but in the sense that he'd had centuries to build a rhythm that suited him. And that rhythm was tilted toward the late hours. Toward the city after midnight, when the volume dropped, and the quality of things shifted. He woke when most people were finishing their second coffee. He worked when most people were asleep. He was available at hours when she was generally unconscious, and occupied at hours when she was generally most productive. They solved this the way you solved logistical problems, by finding the overlap and making it work. She'd also anticipated the social dimension would require navigation. She was correct about this too in some ways. He moved in a world that had its own particular architecture, old money, old blood, centuries of accumulated connection and accumulated enmity. She moved in the event coordinator's world, which intersected with that world at its edges, professionally, contractually, but never from the inside. The first time she accompanied him to a professional function, she registered the looks, assessed them with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd spent years learning not to require other people's approval, and filed them for later consideration. What she hadn't anticipated was how easy the actual being with him would be. She'd expected not difficulty, exactly, but friction. The friction of incompatible speeds, of someone very old alongside someone relatively young, of a person for whom time was a limited resource, and a person for whom it was not. She'd expected to feel the difference constantly, to be perpetually aware of the asymmetry. She was aware of it. It was simply not the dominant thing. The dominant thing was that he listened when she spoke, and spoke when he had something to say, and asked questions that required her to think before she answered, and answered her questions with the same honest precision, and found her interesting in the specific way that felt nothing like flattery and everything like attention. And there was something about being in his company that was, she kept coming back to this word, restful, not boring. Restful, the quality of presence that came from someone who wasn't performing, who had no interest in performing, who had been performing for long enough that they'd arrived at the other side of it and found out what was underneath. The thing underneath, in his case, was someone she liked. She told Priya this over coffee, 6 weeks in. "You like him," Priya said, as if examining the sentence from multiple angles. "I like him," Nadia said. "I know that sounds simple," Priya said. "I was going to say obvious, but it feels significant somehow." Priya stirred her coffee slowly. "You've been with people you didn't particularly like before," she said. "Not judgment, just fact." "I have," Nadia said. "And you've been attracted to people you didn't really like, and liked people you weren't particularly attracted to, and done the whole thing backwards in all kinds of configurations," Priya said. "And it's been fine, and it's been not fine, but it's never been this." She gestured at Nadia with her spoon. "This thing you're doing where you look like you're still in the middle of an open question, but you've already answered it, and you just haven't caught up with yourself yet." Nadia looked at her coffee. "He's going to be here after I'm gone," she said. "That's the math that won't leave me alone. Whatever this is, however it goes, he's going to be here after I'm not." Priya was quiet for a moment. "That's true," she said. "I don't know how to hold that." "Maybe you don't have to," Priya said. Yet, she brought it to him directly, because she was a person who solved problems by looking at them clearly, and this particular problem required them both. They were in his suite on a Tuesday evening, the kind of Tuesday that had arrived at 9 o'clock without her entirely noticing the day becoming night. Her sitting in the chair she'd begun to think of as hers, which was information she was still processing. Him at the long table with his papers and maps, the companionable quiet of two people who'd learned to be in a room together without filling every moment. She said it plainly. "I keep thinking about the fact that I'm going to die and you won't." He set down what he was holding. He didn't rush to the reassurance, which she had both feared and half wanted. He simply turned to face her fully, with the quality of attention he brought to the things that mattered. "I know," he said. "I think about it too." "What do you think?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The considering quiet, not the avoiding one. "I think I've made the mistake before of measuring things by their duration," he said, "of deciding that brief meant less." He looked at her. "A century of watching things end has not made me believe that the ending retroactively empties the before." His voice was even, but underneath it there was something old and carefully held. "I know what the end looks like. I know it with a clarity that I'm not sure is a gift. But I've stopped believing that knowing the end is a reason not to begin." She looked at him. "That sounds like something that cost you something to learn," she said. "Yes," he said simply. She came around the table and sat beside him, which was not something she'd done before in quite that way, closing the distance that had always felt respectful and which now felt like a habit she didn't need anymore. He looked at her when she sat beside him with the expression she'd stopped trying to name and had started simply accepting. "I'm not going anywhere yet," she said. "I want to be here." His hand found hers on the table. He held it with the careful, deliberate quality of someone who understood what they were holding. "Then, be here," he said. She was. The next 3 months moved with the particular quality of time that was being actually lived rather than managed. She noticed this, the way you noticed a change in weather, not dramatically, but clearly. Her work was the same. She moved through venues and events and logistical challenges with the same competent precision, but something about the way she moved through it had shifted. She was making herself smaller, less often, not less professionally, but less personally. She was giving away less of herself to the machinery and keeping more. She started sketching event concepts in a notebook she kept in her bag. Not for clients, just hers. Ideas that arrived while she was solving other people's problems, and which she'd previously filed under someday, and now filed under when. He noticed. He noticed everything. Which she'd come to understand was not surveillance, but attention. The way a person looked when they were genuinely interested in the ongoing project of someone else's life. "The notebook," he said, one evening. "What about it?" she said. "You're carrying it differently," he said. "You used to put it away when I came into the room." She looked at him. "I didn't realize I was doing that," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I mentioned it." She showed him the sketches. He looked at them for a long time, in silence, the focused silence of someone who was actually looking, rather than performing the act of looking. He asked her questions about 3 of them, specific ones, the ones she was most attached to, and his questions were good questions, the kind that illuminated rather than evaluated. "This one," he said, pointing to one she'd started twice and abandoned twice because the scale felt too ambitious. "I don't have the resources to execute that," she said. "Not yet," he said. She looked at him. "That's a beginning, not an obstacle," he said. He looked at the sketch. "What would you need?" She told him. He listened to all of it and then said, "I have 3 properties that haven't been used for events. I also know the architectural firm that redesigned the Meridian Center, and they owe me considerably more than a consultation." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without inflation. Not charity, just logistics. "I'm not taking your money," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm offering access and introductions. What you do with them is yours." She looked at the sketch. She'd been saving up a version of herself for a specific occasion she'd never quite identified. This, she thought, was probably the occasion. The first event under her own name was not grand. She would have liked to tell a different version of this story, the one where the vision arrived fully formed and executed itself flawlessly, and the room was full of people saying exactly the right things, and she felt vindicated and complete, and the work was immediately understood. That was not the story. The actual story was 6 months of the notebook becoming a planning document, becoming a budget, becoming a venue negotiation that went sideways twice, and a catering situation that required her to become temporarily fluent in a logistical language she'd never used. It was Priya sitting across from her at midnight in her apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets, saying "you can do this," while Nadia said, "I am not sure I can do this," and both of them knowing the question wasn't really whether she could. She could. That had never actually been the question. The actual question was whether she was willing to have her name on something that might fail, which was different from coordinating other people's events, where the failure, if it came, was absorbed by the client, by the vendor, by the event itself, and she was always the one who fixed things, rather than the one who stood in the rubble. "I'm afraid of it being mine and not working," she told Caius on a Wednesday night, which was not a sentence she'd planned to say aloud. He was standing at the windows, which was where he stood when he was thinking, she'd learned. He turned and looked at her. "Of course you are," he said. He said it without the disclaimer quality that usually came attached to "of course you are," the social softening that turned an observation into a reassurance. He just said it plainly. "Of course you are." That's the correct response to the situation. "That's not actually comforting," she said. "I know," he said. "But it's true, and I think you prefer truth to comfort." She did. She very much preferred truth to comfort. "What do you do," she said, "when you're afraid of a thing?" He was quiet for a moment. "I ask myself whether the fear is telling me something useful," he said. "Whether there's information in it I should act on, and if there isn't, I do the thing anyway and let the fear come along." "How do you know the difference?" she said. "Practice," he said. "A great deal of time and practice." She had neither the centuries nor the practice. But she had the notebook. And she had Priya. And she had him, which was a thing she'd become accustomed to having, and which she was aware she was accustomed to, which was its own form of information. She did the thing anyway, and let the fear come along. The event was a small benefit concert. 100 guests. A venue that had been a warehouse before she found it, and would be something else after she finished with it. She designed it from concept to execution. The lighting, the layout, the sound, the flow of the evening. The moment where people walked in and understood what they were looking at, and felt the particular combination of surprise and rightness that she'd spent 7 years delivering for other people's visions. It worked. Not perfectly. The catering had a 30-minute delay that required improvisation and the kind of quiet, rapid problem-solving that was, she supposed, her actual gift. The lighting in the second zone ran slightly warm when she'd intended cool. One of the sponsors arrived 90 minutes early and required management. But it worked. The room felt the way she'd intended the room to feel. People moved through the space the way she'd designed people to move. At the end of the evening, the client said, "I don't know how you did this," and for the first time in 7 years, she didn't deflect it, didn't attribute it to her team or the venue or the vendors, didn't make herself small. "I do," she said. And she did. Caius came to the event. She'd told him he didn't need to, with the specific energy of someone who was hoping the offer to not need to would be declined, and he had declined it with the specific energy of someone who understood exactly what she was actually asking. He stood in the back of the room for most of the evening, which was where she'd told herself he'd stand, and which she still found, when she registered it in the middle of managing 3 concurrent situations, deeply settling. He didn't approach her during the event. He understood better than anyone, she thought, the mechanics of someone who worked best when left to work. Afterward, when the room had emptied and her team was breaking down, he came and stood next to her in the center of the space. She could still feel the shape of the event in the air, the residue of a room that had been properly alive. She always felt this at the end of events she'd managed, but it was different this time, fuller somehow, because the room had been alive in a way she'd specifically intended, and the intention had worked. "This is what you meant," he said, "when you said build something." "Yes," she said. He looked around the room with the expression of someone who was understanding something precisely. "You made people feel something specific," he said, "something you planned for them to feel." "That's the job," she said. "But usually it's someone else's plan," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. In the warm light of the emptying venue, she could see his face clearly, which she'd stopped being surprised by. The way she'd stopped being surprised by most things about him. "This looked right on you," he said. "Your own name on something." She looked at the room. "It felt terrifying," she said. "How does it feel now?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to think about things he asked. "Like the first time something fit correctly," she said, "after a long time of wearing the wrong size." He looked at her. "I know that feeling," he said. She looked back at him. They were standing in the middle of a room she'd made, at the end of an evening that had worked, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, in the residue of the event and the warm light and the particular quality of his attention, she understood something she'd been understanding slowly for months, but which arrived in that moment as a finished thought. She was happy, not despite the complications, not around them, not in the brief spaces between them, but in the full condition of her life, which included the complications and the open questions and the fear she'd let come along, and the man standing next to her who would outlast everything she'd ever built. And it was still, taken together, in its entirety, the condition of happiness. She took his hand. He didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who'd been hoping for exactly this, who'd learned the difference between hoping and knowing, and had been holding the hope carefully for a long time. "I want to build more things," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you there for it," she said. "I know that too," he said. His hand closed around hers. "I'd like nothing more." They had their first real argument about a door. Not the door metaphorically, Not a door representing something larger and more complicated. An actual door, specifically the door to the suite on 53, and whether Nadia should have a key to it, and what having a key to it would mean, and whether meaning was the point or whether practicality was the point, and at what exact elevation in that discussion it had become an argument rather than a conversation, which neither of them could later determine precisely. She'd been at the suite 3 or 4 evenings a week for months. She had a coffee cup that lived in his kitchen. She had 2 books on the shelf by the window, placed there on different evenings and never moved, which was its own small form of installation. She knew the elevator code. She knew how he took his coffee. She knew the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking, versus the quality of his silence when something was bothering him, and he was deciding whether to say it. She did not have a key. This had not seemed like a gap until a Thursday, when she arrived at the building and the elevator panel had been updated for a security refresh, and her usual access code no longer worked. And she'd stood in the 45th floor corridor for 4 minutes before reaching him by phone, and he'd sent someone down to authorize her, and the 4 minutes had been entirely fine logistically, but had felt emotionally like something she didn't have a word for yet. She brought it up that evening and he'd said, "Of course, I'll have a key made." And she'd said, "That's not quite what I'm asking." And he'd said, "What are you asking?" And she'd said, "I'm asking whether this is something you're comfortable with the emphasis on whether." And he'd said, "I just said I'll make a key." And she'd said, "Making the key is the action, comfortable is the feeling." And he'd looked at her for a moment and then said, "I've been alone in this building for 11 years, Nadia. Of course I'm comfortable." And she'd said, "You're saying of course, which means you think I'm being." And there it was. She'd said, "Which means you think I'm being." He'd waited. And she'd heard herself stop, because she'd been about to finish that sentence in a way that was less about the key and more about the thing she'd been carrying since a Tuesday 2 months ago, when she'd sat beside him at the table and he'd told her that knowing the end was not a reason not to begin. And he'd held her hand with the deliberate, careful quality of someone who understood what they were holding, and she had been, since that evening, in a condition she didn't have a clean word for, because clean words for it required her to say something she hadn't said yet. She sat down. He sat across from her. "Tell me what you're actually asking," he said. "Not the door." She looked at him. "I want to know," she said carefully, "whether this is." She stopped. Started again. "Whether I'm something you're choosing." Every day. Not because of what happened in an elevator, or because you found my work interesting, or because I didn't panic. Whether I am, as a daily decision, someone you are choosing. The room was quiet. He didn't rush. She'd learned that about him, the unhurried quality of his responses to the things that mattered, and she'd learned not to read the pause as hesitation, but as precision, as someone making sure the words were the right words before he sent them out. "Yes," he said, "every day, yes." She looked at her hands. "I'm not very good at this," she said, "the saying of it. I'm better at the doing." "I know," he said. "I've noticed. I do things that mean things, and I hope people understand what they mean without me having to make them explicit," she said. "It's a deficiency. It's a method," he said, "and I've learned your method." He leaned forward slightly, and she looked up, and he was looking at her with the door in a room that had been closed expression, clear now, nothing in the way of it. "You show up," he said. "Consistently. You show up, and you stay, and you tell me the true things even when they're inconvenient." He paused. "That's not a deficiency. That's the whole of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I love you," she said. There it was. Plain. She'd said it the way she did most things, once she'd decided, clearly and without embellishment, and then sat with what she'd said and the space around it. He looked at her. That expression, the door, fully open now, no ambiguity in it, no restraint, just the full and unguarded fact of it. "I know," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "I have known for a while." He took a breath. "I didn't say it because I was waiting for you to be ready to hear it." She looked at him. "Have I been ready for a while?" she said. "Yes," he said. She made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. "You could have told me. You needed to arrive at it yourself," he said. "If I'd said it first, you'd have spent 3 weeks analyzing whether my version of it was compatible with yours." This was, she recognized with a clarity that was almost annoying, completely accurate. "I love you," he said. "In the way that I have loved very few things in a very long time. In the way that makes me understand why people who know better start things anyway." She crossed the space between them and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, which was different from holding her hand, encompassing in a way that hands weren't, and she sat in the circle of his arm and looked at the city below them. "I'll need a key," she said. She felt him smile against her hair. "Obviously," he said. "And I want my coffee cup moved from the back shelf to the front," she said. "Done," he said. "And I'm going to put more books on the shelves," she said. "Possibly a lot more books." "Good," he said. They were always too sparse. She looked at the city. She looked at the room. She looked at the books on 3 walls and the maps on the long table and the lamp in the corner casting its warm, unhurried light. "I'm going to be here a lot," she said. "That's the hope," he said. The year turned, and then another, and then another. She would not have been able to tell you when exactly she stopped measuring. Not when she stopped keeping count of weeks or tallying the months, but when she stopped holding the shape of the thing in her mind the way you held something fragile, ready to account for it. She'd been doing it for a long time, she understood in retrospect. Running a quiet inventory of the relationship, checking it against itself, asking it to report on its own condition. That habit had a reason, a history she'd accumulated long before elevators and 53 floors, and a man who'd been alone in a building for 11 years. She'd been doing it long before him. She stopped somewhere in the 2nd year, not because the thing had become less, but because she'd stopped needing to check. The way you stopped checking whether a scene would hold when you'd watched it, hold through enough. Her business grew, which she had expected and worked for. The warehouse venue became a flagship. She hired 6 people, then 10, then scaled in the direction of more, though scale had never been the point, and she was careful to build in ways that preserved the thing that made the work hers, the specificity of it, the quality of attention that had always been her actual offering. She turned down the clients who wanted her to replicate someone else's vision. She took the clients who came because they'd heard she understood spaces and people and how to bring them together in ways that meant something. She won an award. This embarrassed her in a way that she reported to Caius as a professional hazard of the evening, and which he found, she could tell, genuinely charming. "You should learn to receive recognition," he said. "I'm working on it," she said. "You've been working on it for 3 years," he said. "It's a long project," she said. He looked at her. "You're very capable of making things work for other people," he said, "and very resistant to letting anyone make things work for you." She considered this. "Is that what you're doing?" she said. "Making things work for me." "I'm trying," he said. "You're a complicated brief." She laughed, the real kind, the kind she hadn't rationed in a long time now. She'd been laughing more, she'd noticed. Not the event laugh, not the professional laugh calibrated to the room. The kind that arrived without being planned and didn't ask permission. He was the cause of a significant percentage of these, which she'd told him once, as a factual report. And he'd looked at her with an expression she'd been meaning to do justice to for years, and had never quite managed. She had started writing things down. Not the event plans, not the business documents, but the other things. The observations she'd always filed and discarded, the notes on a Tuesday evening in a good room, the sentences that arrived while she was sitting in the good chair by his window watching him work. She wrote them in a notebook she kept in her bag, different from the event notebook, a small one with a red cover that had no function she could name yet. She showed it to him eventually, as she'd shown him the event sketches, because he had a quality of attention that made showing him things different from showing other people. He read it slowly, which was how he read everything. He turned the pages without hurrying. "This is very good," he said. "It's just notes," she said. "It's observation," he said. "Precise observation written with complete honesty." He handed it back. "You should keep going." "Of what?" she said. He gestured at the room, the window, himself, all of it. He said, "Someone should." She looked at him. He was 3 centuries old, give or take a decade, which he'd told her with the calm of someone reporting a weather condition. He had moved through so much world, accumulated so much experience, watched so many people and events and centuries, and he had kept almost none of it, or kept it only in the private architecture of his own memory, inaccessible, sealed. The old vampires often worked that way, she'd come to understand. They carried enormous amounts of living that left no record. Someone should keep record of him, she thought, not for posterity, not for history, just because a life that had lasted this long deserved to be witnessed, carefully, by someone who loved it. "I'll keep going," she said. She kept going. The complications that had seemed so large in the beginning, the different speeds, the different social worlds, the accumulated enmities of the immortal sphere, the looks at the functions, the conversations that stopped when she walked in these, had not vanished. They'd become, instead, familiar, the known weather of the life they were building. She'd learned which rooms required more armor and which ones she could enter without it. He'd learned which rooms she needed him to walk beside her rather than ahead. They were, she'd thought on a number of occasions, remarkably well suited for the practical reality of being together, despite the extraordinary implausibility of all the particulars. Her grandmother would have found this very funny, she thought sometimes. Her grandmother had been a practical woman who'd survived 3 countries and 2 widowhoods, and had described love, when asked, as the daily decision made again and again in the unglamorous light of ordinary mornings. That's what it was, Nadia thought. Exactly that. There was a morning, a specific one. She could locate it in memory. A Wednesday in late autumn when the city had gone gray, and the windows were all rain when she woke in the room she'd begun to simply call the room, which was his room and her room, and had been both of those things for long enough that the distinction had stopped being necessary, and she lay in the gray light listening to the rain, and the particular quality of his breathing, and the city below them, and felt something she took a moment to locate correctly. Complete was the word she arrived at. Not finished. Not static. Nothing about this life was static, but the particular completeness that came from a thing being what it was supposed to be, from all the components having found their correct arrangement. She'd spent her professional life creating this feeling for other people in other rooms. She'd always understood it when she'd made it. She hadn't known she'd been building toward it for herself. He woke shortly after, which he did quietly, without the transitional confusion that waking involved for her, already present and aware the way he always was. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. There was a pause that was the best kind of pause, full and uncrowded. "I was thinking," she said. "Dangerous," he said. She smiled. "About the elevator," she said. "The first night." "What about it?" he said. "I keep coming back to it," she said. "The fact that you didn't say anything, you just let me ride it." He looked at her. "You needed a moment," he said. Same answer as the first time she'd asked, which had been years ago, and which hadn't changed. "I know," she said. "But I've been thinking about what you actually did. You saw a person who was tired and slightly lost, and instead of pointing out that she was in the wrong place, you just stayed quiet. Gave her the ride." His expression was unreadable in the way it sometimes was when she got close to something he'd been holding privately. "I had been waiting," he said quietly, "for something. He was choosing his words. I hadn't known what I was waiting for. But when you walked into that elevator, I understood that whatever I'd been waiting for had probably looked different in the imagining. Less ordinary, less tired, less in need of a moment. His voice was even. And I thought, if this is it, I'm not going to ruin it by speaking first. She looked at him. You knew, she said. In the elevator. I hoped, he said. She remembered the distinction he'd made, hoping versus knowing, what he'd learned not to confuse. She reached over and took his hand, which was warm the way it had always been warm, which she'd stopped finding surprising and started finding simply true. His hand, the warmth of it, the steadiness of it. 47 floors, she said. He smiled, the real one, the one she'd collected, the one that had been rare when she first arrived and wasn't anymore. 47 floors, he said. Outside the windows, the autumn rain continued its work against the city. The room held them in its light, warm and purposeful. The books on 3 walls, the red notebook on the table, the coffee cups in their correct positions, the accumulated evidence of a life being lived the right way, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with the full and deliberate attention that was. She had come to understand. The only thing that made any of it mean something. She had made herself small for a very long time. She was done with that now. The Vos Grand held a renovation gala the following spring. Nadia coordinated it. This had not been planned. She'd been engaged on a separate project, a 3-venue series for a cultural foundation, and was already at the comfortable edge of capacity when Heloise called and said, with the precise tone of someone who had been waiting a long time to make this call, that the hotel was updating the Grand Hall and marking the occasion with an event, and had she any interest? She had interest. She also had, for the first time in her career, the leverage to coordinate an event at the Vos Grand on terms she set, rather than terms she accommodated. She negotiated with Heloise as an equal. She brought her own team, her own vendors, her vision for what the evening should feel like. Caius had offered, once, to facilitate the introduction with the hotel's ownership, which included Vos, which included him in some configuration she'd never fully mapped. She had declined, and he had understood immediately, which was one of the things about him she'd trusted earliest, and trusted most. She needed this to be hers. It was hers. The Grand Hall on the 47th floor was transformed by 8 o'clock into something she'd drawn in the red notebook on a rainy Wednesday, a version of the drawing that had been adjusted and refined through 6 months of planning and 2 significant arguments with her lead designer about the color temperature of the ambient lighting. The room felt like the moment just after dusk, that specific blue-gray quality of light when the day has committed to becoming night but hasn't fully arrived there yet, full of potential, full of the suspended feeling of transition. 120 guests moved through the space with the ease of people in a room that was working correctly. She watched from the edges, which was where she'd always worked best. At some point, Priya appeared beside her with 2 glasses of something sparkling and the expression of a person who had been here for the whole story and knew exactly what this evening represented. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "This is excellent," Priya said, gesturing at the room. "Thank you," Nadia said, and she received it, simply, the way she'd been practicing. "I remember you in the closet of the Meridian Center eating a granola bar at 11 at night," Priya said. "Because you'd been on your feet for 9 hours and hadn't had dinner." "That was a while ago," Nadia said. "A while," Priya agreed. "And now look at you." Nadia looked at the room. Her room. She'd made it exactly the way she'd imagined it, which was rarer than it should have been, the gap between imagined and executed. And she'd closed that gap here through effort and time, and the accumulated competence of someone who had spent years learning her craft from the inside. He found her near the windows at 9:30. He always found her. This was something she'd stopped trying to explain logically, the specific way he moved through a room toward her, unhurried but certain, The way you moved toward something you knew was there. He stood beside her and looked at the room. Well, he said. She looked at him. It's exactly right, he said. She looked back at the room. It was exactly right. The light, the movement, the quality of the evening, the way the city was visible through the tall windows, placed in its correct relation to the people inside, present but not intrusive. I was thinking about something, she said. Always thinking, he said. I was thinking about the fact that we're standing in the room where I first thought about you, she said. After the elevator, I came back up here and went through the rest of the wedding and thought about the elevator the whole time. He looked at her. I was thinking about you too, he said. Were you up here? She said. He paused. 53, he said. Yes, she took a moment with this. Him on 53, her on 47, both in the same building thinking about the same 16 floors. You could have come down, she said. Introduced yourself. Explained, I wasn't ready, he said. What were you waiting for? She said. He looked at her. The same look as always, the door fully open, nothing hidden in it, just the plain and undefended fact of how he looked at her. To know what I wanted to ask, he said. Did you figure it out? She said. Eventually, he said. With your help. She smiled at the room. I'm going to do something else after this, she said. Bigger. I have the concept. I've been working on it in the notebook. Tell me, he said. She told him. The full version, the one she'd been building for months, not edited for practicality or scaled back for reasonableness. He listened the way he listened, entirely, without preparation for his own response, just attention given fully to what she was saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That will require a great deal of work, he said. Yes, she said. You'll need 3 venues, not 1, he said. Yes, she said. And the coordination with the city's arts foundation is going to be significantly more political than you're planning for, he said. Probably, she said. He looked at the room. I know someone at the foundation, he said. Not to facilitate, to introduce. What you do with the introduction is yours. I know, she said, and the 3 venues, he said. I have 2 that would work, long-term leases, currently unused. You can negotiate terms with the property manager, he added, as he always added, which she no longer needed to be told but which she appreciated him saying anyway. She looked at him. Do you want to know why I'm telling you all this? She said. I think I know, he said. Tell me anyway, she said. Because it's ours, he said. Not the event, not the venues, the telling of it, the planning of it, the doing of it, and then the next one after it. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that always moved her when she heard it, that old and careful hope. You tell me the things you're building, and I help where I'm useful, and you make them yours. He looked at her. And then you come home. Come home. She'd been thinking about the word for months. She'd been turning it in her hands the way you turned something whose weight you were still learning. Home had been the apartment above the corner grocery, earned and defended, entirely hers, small, in the way that things are small when they've been built from nothing. Home had been the loft in the arts district, more space and her own work, and the growing proof that the life she'd imagined could be the life she actually had. This building. This man. 53 floors up, the city spread in every direction, the books on 3 walls, and the warm light of the lamp, and the coffee cups in their right places. She'd been moving toward it for a long time. She took his hand. There's something I want to ask you, she said. He waited, which was how he waited, as if he had all the time there was, because he did. The notebook, she said. The red one. I've been writing in it for 3 years now. I know, he said. I want to show you all of it, she said. Not select parts. All of it. Everything I've been paying attention to. She looked up at him. "And I want you to know that I'm asking you to read it, not because you're useful or because you'll give me good feedback, but because it's all about you. Mostly. About watching you. About learning you. About what it's like to be in a life with someone who makes you feel like you can use your whole size." He was very still. The coiled spring quality she'd first noticed in the elevator, but different now. The stillness of someone receiving something he hadn't dared hope for clearly enough to ask. "Give me the notebook," he said. She reached into her bag. She gave it to him. He held it in both hands, looking at it, the red cover, the 3 years of close and honest attention, the record of a life being paid full attention. Then, he looked at her. "You know I'm going to be here," he said, after. His voice was careful, which was how his voice was when he was being most honest. "After everything. And I want you to know that, when that happens." "I know what that means," she said quietly. "I've always known what that means." "I want you to know," he said, "that every day of this will have mattered. Every single one. No day with you in it is going to dissolve into the length of everything else." He held the notebook. "I'll carry all of it, for as long as there is a me to carry it." She held his gaze. She let herself be seen. "Good," she said. The room around them continued its evening, 120 people in the space she'd made, the city visible through tall windows, the blue-gray light of transition, doing exactly what she'd intended. She would build the next thing. And the thing after that, and he would be there for all of it, reading the notebook, standing at the windows, holding her coffee cup in the correct position on the front shelf, asking the good questions. And she would keep writing it all down. Someone should. The elevator doors opened on 47, as they always did, as they had from the beginning, not because she'd pressed anything, but because she was expected. She always would be.